said here, and there was a slide that should have gone right about here, is that in June of this year, the LA Times, in response to an op-ed by a law professor here at UCLA that criticized racial microaggressions, ran a lead editorial criticizing racial microaggressions. And Lindsay and I, within 36 hours, we wrote a 800-word response to the LA Times that never got published. And I'll come back to that story in a second. But basically, we were concerned the way in which the concept of microaggressions was being framed in the media, especially in the print media. And it's nothing new. It's something that's been going on for a while now. But here's part of what we wanted to say. I mean, and you're going to hear some of it's truncated. It's focused on Latinas and Latinos. And so the work that we do is centered around the work of Chester Pierce, an emeritus professor at Harvard University in the School of Medicine and School of Education. And he started developing the concept of microaggressions in about 1970. And so we recognize him as the person who really got us into this work. For over 45 years ago, Chet started doing this work on racial microaggressions. And this is Chet Pierce. What Chet said in 1974, about 41 years ago, what Chet said is that one must not look for the gross and obvious. The subtle, cumulative mini-assault is the substance of today's racism. He said that 41 years ago. I think we can say the same thing today. That it's these subtle, constant, cumulative assaults on people of color that are really the substance of today's racism. And I'll try to give you some examples of that. So how do we define racial microaggressions? I'm going to go through this really quickly. We say that racial microaggressions are one form of systemic everyday racism used to keep those at the racial margins in their place. We go on to say that racial microaggressions are verbal and nonverbal assaults, and I'll give you examples of that in a second, directed towards people of color, often carried out in subtle, automatic or unconscious forms. We say often because they're not always subtle. They're not always unconscious. They're not always automatic. We also say that they're layered assaults. So we may enter into this discussion around race, but quickly it moves to gender, class, sexuality, language, immigration status, phenotype, accent, surname, right? So there's these layered assaults that come out that are part of this idea of racial microaggressions. And they're cumulative assaults. You probably can't see that way in the back, but that they're cumulative assaults that take a physiological, a psychological, and an academic toll on people of color or people on the receiving end of these racial microaggressions. And so in 1994, we get the question often, and you may hear this often, that, well, that wasn't micro to me. That sounded more like macro, right? And we tried to respond, and we tried to use Chet's work, 40 years of work, to respond. But this is what Chet said in 1974. He said, these problems are only micro in name, since their very number requires a total effort that is incalculable. Again, that cumulative impact of everyday racism. So what we say is that the micro and microaggressions doesn't mean less than. The micro and microaggressions means in the everyday. That's how we're defining, that's how we're framing microaggressions. And so that's our response to people who often tell us, it doesn't feel micro to me. So we look at racial microaggressions within the context of institutional racism. And so this is the context in which they take place, in which you have a perpetrator and you have a primary target, someone on the receiving end of that. You also have what we call secondary targets. You might not be the person who the assault is directed towards, but you still feel it, you still hear it, you still see it, right? And so that's what my work and the work that many of the folks I work with, we focus on the primary and secondary targets. That's the work we do. We don't look at the perpetrator, or we don't focus on the perpetrator. We look at her or him, but we don't focus on them. And part of the reason we don't is because that research focuses on their intent. What did they intend to do? And often when you ask perpetrators, what do you intend to do, they'll run around and tell you, well, I didn't really mean it that way. Or I meant it as a compliment. Or can't you, aren't you being a little too sensitive about race? Right? And so we don't focus on intent. And I say that because if there's a question that comes later, can a person of color engage in a racial microaggression against another person of color, then I'm going to take that back. Because there we do talk about intent. But it's when people of color interact in this way in these various contexts. But when the perpetrator is, in this case, white, we don't. I don't look at that work. Daryl Sue looks at that work. He does an amazing job of research in this area. We look at the impact. What is the impact of these everyday forms of racism on the people on the receiving end of these racial microaggressions? And so, types. Verbal microaggressions. I'm going to start with this is work that really began, I didn't begin doing this work studying microaggressions. I began doing this work studying marginality. I went back and reanalyzed the data. And this is some of the data I went back and reanalyzed. I was studying scientists, Chicana and Chicano scientists, PhDs, academics in science. And one of the women that I interviewed years ago was this Chicana biochemist. So when I went back and analyzed the data, it's microaggressions began to come out of my interviews, my transcripts. And this is what she said. Being a student was hard enough. Being a Chicano adds more weight. Being a woman adds still another burden. And being from working class parents seems to add an extra load that many of my white middle class male colleagues did not have to carry, just don't have to carry. But when they, whites, find themselves in a similar position, they might have a better understanding of what I go through on a day-to-day basis. So in essence, she was talking about racial microaggressions and gender microaggressions in this particular interview. And this really helped me sort of reconceptualize from marginality to microaggressions as I went back and reanalyzed this data. But we've been collecting data now for over 20 years in various contexts, mostly in higher education, in undergraduate, graduate school, and law schools. And so this is examples. You're not like the rest of them. You're different. Now, that's meant to be a compliment, I think, right? If you're on the sending end of that, again, the intent. But if you're on the receiving end of that, that might not be so complimentary. I don't think of you as Mexican. Unfortunately, we hear a lot of that in the academy. You speak such good English, right? Again, meant to be a compliment. But you speak without an accent. We hear this often. And so I'm going to give you a couple of more examples from colleagues of ours who've helped research on racial microaggressions. This is one, and I'll read it for us. And race matters for reasons that are only skin deep, that cannot be discussed any other way, that cannot be wished away. Race matters to a young man's view of society when he spends his teenage years watching others tense up as he passes. That's a nonverbal. It's a nonverbal assault. No matter the neighborhood where he grew up. Race matters to a young woman's sense of self when she states her hometown and then is pressed, "No, where are you really from?" Regardless of how many generations her family has been in this country. Race matters to a young person addressed by a stranger in a foreign language, which he does not understand because only English was spoken at home. Race matters because of the slights, the snickers, the silent judgments that reinforce the most crippling of thoughts. I do not belong here. Anyone want to venture a guess who that is? Some of you know, but because you probably heard this before. But anyone who hasn't seen this quote, want to venture who made this quote? Justice Sotomayor, right? In a dissenting opinion last term, in April of last year, in an affirmative action case called Schuett versus Bam, and basically her and Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote this dissent. I mean, if you go look at that 51-page dissent, it's an amazing treatise on historical racism, institutional racism, that she's trying to get her colleagues. This is addressed to her colleagues, telling them, you got it wrong, because you're not looking at everyday forms of racism. You're not looking at institutional racism. You're not looking at structural racism. So some nonverbal microaggressions. I'll give one more quote. There are very few African American men in this country who haven't had the experience of being followed when they were shopping in a department store. Again, that's nonverbal. That includes me. There are very few African American men who haven't had the experience of walking across the street and hearing the locks click on the doors of cars. That happens to me. There are very few African Americans who haven't had the experience of getting on an elevator and a woman clutching her purse nervously and holding her breath until she had a chance to get off. That happens often. Anyone? President Obama. In July 19, 2013, in a 17-minute press conference right after the verdict, the George Zimmerman verdict in the murder of Trayvon Martin. This is that same press conference where he said, Trayvon Martin could have been me. Trayvon Martin could have been my son. Right? It was a really powerful press conference. Again, YouTube it, go back and listen to the 17-minute sort of press conference he gave. Because he's talking about racial microaggressions. And Just Sotomayor is talking about racial microaggressions, but she's not saying it. They're not saying it. But they're clearly part of the way in which we're looking at these concepts. So visual microaggressions. This is Dimmick, Texas, 1949, right? And again, it's a sign in a restaurant. It says, "We serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans." And someone might ask, well, that doesn't seem micro to me. Well, in 1949, if you lived in Dimmick, Texas, this is racism in the everyday. This is Jim Crow racism, right? This is how people lived. And so that's how we're framing racial microaggressions. We're saying that it's in the everyday, how people experience it in the everyday. Let's move to 2013, Philadelphia, right? What does Jim Crow look like in 2013? Well, it might look like Gino Steaks, this really famous Philly cheesesteak place in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Joey Vento, if you go to his website, it's an amazing website because he's this anti-immigrant rant on that website. But this is what he says. This is America when ordering speak English. Wow. Right? So this is what it looks like in 2013. This is probably more blatant than it looks like in 2013. But this is clearly, it reminded me of the Dimmick, Texas sort of sign, but circa 2013. It also occurs in children's books. And this is a story that Lindsay and I wrote about. And we actually presented at conferences with Layla Verhanhuber, her daughter. And so this is an example, a quick example of a book that Lindsay and Layla were reading one night. It's called Don't Tell Lies, Lucy, a cautionary tale. And in this story, this is a young girl who tells lies to her friends and family, etc. And at one point says, Lucy borrowed Paul's bike. She rides it into a tree. It wasn't my fault, Paul. A bandit jumped out in front of me. So again, this idea of these everyday forms of racism can make their way into when you're reading a book to your child, right? So again, be careful what you read. I mean, that's one of our takeaways from that. But it's an amazing story, and if we have an article that we've written on this, but Layla is a star of that article. She actually should have been our co-author of that piece, but she's actually our co-presenter. She's been on a couple of occasions. Another example, this is on one side of the country. This is the Kappa Alpha Theta sorority at Columbia University in February 2014. I suppose this was a dressed up like a Mexican party, theme party, right? These have been around for generations. Fast forward to April of this year. This is the UC Davis lacrosse women's team, right? They posted this on their website, basically dressed up like cholos, Mexican cholos. Right? Again, what are people thinking? Right? I mean, is this the new Jim Crow? Is this the new way of talking about Jim Crow in 2014, 2015? We have multiple examples of that one, by the way. So I want to remind you that it's the cumulative impact of verbal and nonverbal microaggressions that we have to always be aware of. We have to keep coming back to the cumulative effect, right? And the people who criticize this work never focus on the cumulative effect, right? They focus on the one-offs. Or just one example, not the cumulative examples that people of color experience. So I gave you the types of context. Again, malls, you see this happening in shopping malls all the time, where people of color are hyper visible in these spaces, right? Where you walk into a store and people follow you, the clerks will follow you around the store, constantly sort of asking you if they can help you. Really what they want you to do is they want you to leave. Or you can be invisible in those stores or restaurants when you don't get service, where people ignore you because they don't feel that, no, this person shouldn't be here. Maybe if we just ignore them, they'll leave this particular space, whether it's a restaurant or a retail store. Effects, the impact of these racial microaggressions. They hurt, they're painful. And often people who critique these never talk about the pain, never talk about the hurt that people of color experience. They get you angry and stressed, as our